If you look at a building right before it collapses,
Right.
sometimes the outside looks completely fine. Like the paint is fresh, the windows are clean.
Yeah, everything looks structurally sound.
Exactly. But inside, the load-bearing walls have been, entirely hollowed out by termites.
Mm-hmm.
You lean on the wrong tiller, and the whole thing just comes down in a cloud of dust.
It's a great analogy.
Yeah, because we like things to look solid, so we just ignore the rot underneath. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at a historical moment where an entire nation functioned just like that hollowed-out building.
Mm.
We're talking about Kenya in the 1990s.
And we're exploring this through a meticulously researched stack of notes and excerpts from Daniel Branch's book, Kenya, Between Hope and Despair, 1963 to 2011.
Right. Such a good book.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to zero in exclusively on Chapter 7 of this text.
Which is?
It's called The Goldenberg Years, 1993 to 2002, which covers a highly turbulent and really a defining decade.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to explore this really chilling decade to understand how massive financial corruption and state-sponsored disorder didn't just happen concurrently by accident.
No, not at all.
They were part of a single, brutal mechanism. They basically became deliberate political tools that pushed a nation to the absolute brink of collapse.
Yeah, that's the core of it.
So let's start with the economic rot that secretly funded all this political chaos. Because the sources paint a stark contrast between what was being said in public and, what was actually happening in the dark.
That contrast is the perfect entry point, really. You just cannot separate the economics of this era from the violence that followed. I mean, if we look at the political stage in the 1990s, President Daniel Arap Moi was publicly promising voters a calmer and more confident Kenya.
Right.
He was out there delivering speeches emphasizing that political differences shouldn't result in endless confrontation.
Which sounds great, right?
Exactly. It sounded like a reassuring message of unity during a time of massive global transition.
But behind that fresh coat of paint, the country was being financially gutted by something called the Goldenberg scandal.
Yeah.
And when you read the details of this, it is almost hard to comprehend the sheer audacity of it.
It really is staggering.
I mean, it wasn't just a case of politicians skimming a little off the top of a construction contract.
Yeah.
It was essentially a massive, systemic export fraud.
To understand how Goldenberg worked, you really have to look at the mechanics of the Kenyan economy at that specific moment.
Okay.
So in the early 90s, the international community and major donors had basically frozen aid to Kenya.
Because they were demanding political and economic reforms. Right?
Exactly. They wanted multi-party democracy. They wanted transparency. So the country was experiencing a severe foreign exchange crisis. I mean, they desperately needed foreign currency to keep the economy afloat.
Right.
So the government introduces this scheme to incentivize businesses. They offered a massive 35% subsidy to any company that brought in foreign currency through exports.
Wait, let me make sure I have the underlying logic here. If a company exported $100 worth of goods and brought that foreign cash back into Kenya, the government would reward them by just handing over an extra $35 in local currency from the public treasury.
Precisely the mechanism.
Wow.
I mean, it was meant to stimulate genuine trade, but a company called Goldenberg International stepped in and just exploited this loophole on an industrial scale.
Yeah.
They claimed they were exporting huge quantities of gold and diamonds out of Kenya, and the government was dutifully paying them that massive 35% subsidy for doing so.
Except there is one massive glaring problem with that business model.
Oh, a huge problem.
Kenya doesn't even mine gold or diamonds in any meaningful commercial quantities.
Right.
Like the country's geology simply doesn't support it. So what were they actually doing? Just faking the paperwork.
Falsifying the paperwork was the primary method, yeah. They were generating phantom exports out of thin air.
Unbelievable.
I mean, in some instances, they were smuggling very small, trivial amounts of gold from neighboring countries just to have something physical to show.
Just a prop.
Exactly, a prop. But the vast majority of it was simply numbers on a ledger. They were getting paid millions and millions in public funds for exports that literally never existed.
Wow.
The treasury was essentially emptied directly into the pockets of a very small, well-connected political elite.
And the scale of the robbery is staggering. I mean, it robbed Kenya of hundreds of millions of dollars.
Hundreds of millions.
And we only know the true depths of this theft because of the incredible bravery of a whistleblower named David Munyakai.
Yes.
He was a clerk at the Central Bank of Kenya. And he saw these massive discrepancies crossing his desk, huge payments going out for non-existent gold.
Right.
And he risked absolutely everything to expose it.
Everything.
I mean, he risked his career, his freedom, and his life to smuggle out the documents that showed the world what was actually happening.
What's fascinating here is that we often view white-collar crime through a very sanitized lens.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, we think of it as a victimless crime, or at least a bloodless one. You know, a few rich people moving money around in offshore accounts.
Right. Nobody gets hurt directly.
But the text makes it incredibly clear that the financial hollowing out of the state directly destroyed the social fabric of Kenya.
Oh, absolutely.
When a state goes bankrupt because its leaders have looted the treasury, the cascading effects are immediate and devastating.
Because the money is just gone.
Exactly. There is no money to stock hospitals with medicine, no money to pave roads, and crucially,
This is the scary part.
no money to pay the police or maintain legitimate order.
It's like the CEO of a company sending out glossy brochures about a bright future while secretly draining the employee pension fund to pay off the security guards who are actively intimidating the shareholders.
That is a perfect way to put it.
And that economic vacuum paved the way directly for physical violence on the streets. Because the state's coffers were emptied by scams like Goldenberg, traditional governance completely collapsed.
Yeah.
And in its place, according to the text, a dark new political currency emerged.
This brings us to the political crisis that was running parallel to the economic one. The 1990s in Kenya saw the return of multi-party democracy.
Right.
For a long time, Kenya had functioned as a one-party state under KNU. But with the end of the Cold War, the international community essentially forced the regime to allow opposition parties.
Okay, so they had to actually compete.
Yes. The ruling elite suddenly faced a terrifying prospect. They could actually lose an election.
Wait, let me make sure I'm tracking the timeline as a causality here.
Okay.
The government is completely broke from the Goldenberg heist.
Right.
Meaning they can't rely on the old patronage networks to just buy loyalty anymore.
They don't have the cash.
And at the exact same time, they're being forced into competitive multi-party elections.
Exactly.
So in just a few years, we go from white-collar banking fraud in Nairobi to a situation where politicians have to find a brand new way to secure their seats. How fast did this social fabric actually unravel?
I mean, almost instantly. Because they couldn't buy voters anymore, they realized they had to terrify them.
Wow.
Daniel Branch introduces a key concept from the source material to explain the shift. He calls it the rise of agents of disorder.
Agents of disorder.
Yeah. The state essentially franchised out its monopoly on violence. Thuggery and the management of private, armed militias literally became the new political system.
That's terrifying.
The politicians who thrived during this turbulent decade were those who could manage criminality and distribute the spoils of office to their violent clients.
So you didn't win an election by having the best agricultural policies or building the best schools.
No, not at all.
You won by having the most intimidating militia backing your campaign.
And that completely changes the nature of the state. It relies on plausible deniability.
How so?
Well, the government could throw up its hands and tell international observers, oh, these are just ancient tribal hatreds boiling over. It's a tragedy, but it's out of our control.
While secretly funding them.
Exactly. While secretly funding, arming, and directing the very militias carrying out the attacks.
It sounds like trying to use a controlled forest fire to clear weeds in your garden.
Right.
Like you think you're just burning out the pests, but eventually the wind shifts and your own house catches fire.
Oh, inevitably.
If a state relies on empowering street thugs and militias to win elections, doesn't that chaos eventually turn around and consume the politicians themselves?
That is the defining paradox of this era. The architects of this strategy firmly believed they were managing the chaos, not surrendering to it.
Right.
They didn't just unleash absolute anarchy everywhere across the country. They thought they could use violence like a scalpel.
A scalpel?
Yeah, turning it on and off, directing it at very specific opposition strongholds while keeping the capital, Nairobi, relatively insulated and functioning.
Which explains the geography of the violence.
Exactly.
To understand how these agents of disorder operated without instantly destroying the central government, we have to look at how the bloodshed was geographically isolated. It was targeted at specific communities in regional flashpoints, right? Primarily the Coast Province and the Rift Valley.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is what the sources refer to as security zoning.
Security zoning.
Yeah, the violence was highly instrumental. It wasn't just random, spontaneous anger. It was a calculated method of violently altering the demographics of voting constituencies to secure political power.
It's gerrymandering, but with torches and machetes instead of a pen.
That is exactly the mechanism. If a local politician knows that a certain ethnic group has migrated to their district and is likely to vote for the opposition, the most ruthless, effective way to win that district is to burn down their homes and businesses so they flee before Election Day.
That is just brutal.
You literally change the demographic makeup of the map to ensure your own victory.
The details in the text documenting this are harrowing. I mean, the sources highlight reports like Kayas of Deprivation, Kayas of Blood, which was put together by the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and it detailed the absolute terror inflicted on communities in the Coast Province. And we see similar violent clashes brewing in the Narok Diocese.
It was widespread.
You have this massive internal displacement going on. Migration itself was basically weaponized.
Yes.
Kikuyu populations, for instance, who had moved to the coast or the Rift Valley looking for work, farming land, or business opportunities, were suddenly targeted and brutally driven out by state-backed local militias.
And notice how the state's official apparatus responds to this.
How so?
Well, state security forces, the actual police and military, would magically be absent when the raids happened.
Conveniently.
Or they would mysteriously face logistical delays and arrive hours too late to do anything but count the bodies.
Wow.
This allowed the regime to maintain a democratic facade for those international donors demanding reform while basically engineering the electoral outcomes through sheer terror.
But as we know from history, when a state deliberately outsources violence to win elections, the controlled forest fire never stays controlled. You breed grassroots monsters that you can no longer command. And that brings us to the Mungiki.
The Mungiki represents the ultimate blowback of this strategy. They are a profound case study in what happens when the state completely abandons its responsibilities.
Right.
And just leaves a massive vacuum of power and security in the streets.
I have to share the backstory from the text because it starts in such an unexpected place.
Yeah, it really does.
The Mungiki started in the late 1980s and early 90s, not as a political gang, but essentially as a fringe religious sect.
Right, totally different origin.
They rejected Western culture entirely. They bathed in rivers, wore dreadlocks, prayed facing Mount Kenya, and claimed to be the true sons of the Mau Mau, referencing the guerrilla fighters who battled the British for independence back in the 1950s.
Which is a very powerful historical narrative to tap into.
Exactly, and they appealed heavily to deeply disenfranchised, impoverished young men who felt completely abandoned by the modern, corrupt Kenyan state.
They provided a sense of belonging, an income and a radical identity to youths who had absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
In the absence of a functioning economy and, again, tracing this back to the Goldenberg theft and the collapse of public services, these young men essentially created their own parallel society.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
They didn't stay a fringe religious group focused on river baptisms. As the 90s wore on, they morphed into a highly organized, subversive, and extremely dangerous militia.
They evolved.
Right. They realized where the actual money and power was, and they started taking over the informal transport sector, specifically the matatus.
Which is huge in Kenya.
Right. Let's explain this, because if you aren't familiar with Kenyan infrastructure, a matatu might just sound like a bus stop.
Right.
But matatus are privately owned minibuses that serve as the primary public transport network for millions of people.
Yeah, it's the lifeblood of the city.
So taking over the matatu routes isn't just loitering at a bus stop. It's like a mafia completely seizing control of the subway system of a major metropolis like New York or London and violently demanding a cut of every single ticket sold.
And because they had incredible numbers, rigid organization, and a terrifying willingness to use extreme violence to protect their rackets, the politicians who were constantly looking for new agents of disorder suddenly saw the Mungiki as the perfect tools.
Of course they did.
The gang became deeply entwined in the national succession race, acting as guns for hire for the highest political bidder.
The politicians thought they were hiring a guard dog, but they actually invited a wolf into the house.
This raises an important question about the very nature of statehood.
What do you mean?
Well, what happens to the sovereignty of a nation when it operates like this? The sources point out that the Mungiki became so powerful, so deeply entrenched in the slums of Nairobi and the towns of Central Province, that official government ministers literally had to call for truces with them.
Think about the philosophical and practical implications of that.
Exactly.
A sovereign government, with its own official police force and military, is reduced to sitting at a negotiating table with an organized street gang just to maintain a tenuous grip on power.
It signifies the complete evaporation of the state's legitimate authority.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, by the end of this lost decade, all of these factors converged into a perfect storm.
Everything hit at once.
The toxic combination of the stolen Goldenberg millions, the orchestrated ethnic bloodshed driving people from their homes in the Rift Valley and the coast, and these rogue, uncontrollable militias like the Munkiki holding the transport sector hostage.
Yeah.
It brought the nation to the very edge of the abyss.
The culmination of all this was the period leading up to the 2002 elections. The social contract wasn't just broken, it was shredded.
Yeah, it was gone.
The economy was stagnant, physical infrastructure was collapsing, and violence was an everyday normalized political tool.
The sources paint a dire, almost apocalyptic picture of Kenya in 2002. And it wasn't just detached international observers saying this. It was the Kenyans themselves who were living through the nightmare.
Absolutely.
I want to quote opposition MP James Orengo directly from the text. In 2000, looking around at the destruction, he issued a stark warning. He said, "Kenya faces its severest crisis ever. Total collapse is now a real possibility."
It's a heavy quote.
The state simply could not sustain the immense weight of its own corruption and the violence it had unleashed.
That desperation, that palpable sense of a nation standing on a precipice, is beautifully captured by the haunting quote that Daniel Branch uses to open this very chapter.
I love that quote.
It asks a profound question about the nature of the suffering the country was enduring. It reads, "The blood of innocent Kenyans continues to flow in the river of time. Is it the blood of a collapsing order gasping for breath as it crumbles into a state of anarchy? Or is it the blood of convulsive maternal pangs giving birth to a new and better Kenya?"
So what does this all mean for us, looking back at these sources? You know, when we translate this historical moment into a broader lesson, it becomes a masterclass in causality.
Yes, it connects all the dots.
It shows you exactly how quickly white-collar, institutional corruption, literally just numbers moving on a Goldenberg ledger in a quiet, air-conditioned bank, translates directly into physical violence.
Right. Burning homes and machetes on the streets.
It wasn't two separate crises. It was one single mechanism of state failure. And it makes it incredibly clear why, by 2002, the Kenyan people finally realized that the ruling party, KNU, and President Moi absolutely had to fall.
Right.
For the country to survive, the architects of this chaos had to be removed.
And that realization led to an incredible political mobilization. The 2002 election was a watershed moment.
Huge.
The voters mobilized in massive numbers, uniting across ethnic lines in a way the regime completely failed to anticipate to finally vote them out. It was a moment of immense hope, a collective belief that perhaps the blood spilled was indeed the maternal pangs of a new nation, rather than the death rattle of the old one. The citizens effectively used the ballot box to say, enough.
What a journey it has been to unpack the mechanics of this history. We want to thank you for joining us on this intense deep dive into Chapter 7 of Daniel Branch's work.
It's definitely not an easy era to digest.
No. But understanding how economic scams and state-sponsored violence interact to create a decade of despair is crucial to understanding how power actually operates in the real world.
Absolutely. And as we close, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that extends beyond the celebration of that 2002 election.
Okay, let's hear it.
The sources show us how agents of disorder were hired by the state to do its dirty work to survive the 1990s. But here is the chilling reality.
Yeah.
When a dictatorial regime is finally pushed to the brink of collapse and voted out, those militias, those corrupt agents, and those deeply entrenched networks of thuggery, they don't just magically disappear into thin air.
They're still there in the structure of the building.
Exactly the point. If an entire generation of politicians built their careers, their fortunes, and their influence on thuggery and private militias, does a democratic change in the presidency actually reform the underlying system?
Right.
Or do the thugs simply put on new suits, learn the new democratic buzzwords, and find new bosses to pay them?
Wow.
When you inherit a house where the walls are entirely hollowed out by termites, a fresh coat of paint on the outside doesn't mean the foundation is secure. How long until someone leans on the wrong pillar again?